Hello, seventh graders. I hope you guys are doing well out there at your houses. I hope you're not getting too bored. This will give you something to do. Maybe you'll find some other things as well. But we got to make sure we're safe during this time period with COVID-19 coming on. Uh, all right, so we looked at the revolt of 1847 and how Governor Bent got assassinated. And now we're going to jump forward. There's some other stuff I would like to talk about, but we just don't have a whole lot of time, and I've got really short lessons here for you. So we're going to move to something that's really quite important. That's the American Civil War in New Mexico. Okay, but in order to understand how the American Civil War took place in New Mexico, we have to go back to the United States, and we have to look at how this war got started. Okay, so here we go. All right. There's a picture of Abraham Lincoln right here. And most people know who Abraham Lincoln is. He's the 16th president of the United States. He was elected in 1860. He had a platform that said that he would not tolerate or he would not accept slavery. He thought it was wrong and he wanted to contain it just in the South. And there was three parties: the Whigs, the Democrats, Republicans. He was a Republican, and he won. And because he won, the slave states, which there were about 11 at the time, these slave states didn't want to be part of the United States anymore because they knew Abraham Lincoln was going to end slavery. Okay, so they wanted to do what's called secession, to secede, to leave the United States. Now let's take a look at what the United States was at the time of 1860. This is the election process. All the blues are northern states or western states that went along with Abraham Lincoln and they voted for Abraham Lincoln. The light blue states are what's called the border states. They also went with Abraham Lincoln, but and eventually they sided with the North or the Union, and they also had you had slavery in these states. Okay, there's one, two, three, one, two, three, four, five. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the fifth one is West Virginia, which separated from Virginia because they didn't want to have slavery. Okay, the ones in the red are the southern states, and these are the states that have slavery. They have slavery because they make a lot of money on it, and they plant cotton, rice, sugar, tobacco, those kind of things, and they make quite a bit of money on it, and they don't want to lose that profit that they get from slavery. Okay, so now Abraham Lincoln is now the president, and these states in the red, all of them eventually leave the United States. This is 1860. Well, we all know that slavery is wrong today. We feel that way, but there was also people who are somewhat modern thinkers of the time. They're in the North. They're called abolitionists. They want to abolish slavery. They want to get rid of slavery. They say slavery is wrong, and they gave several valid examples. It places people in bondage. You're stuck in a prison type system. They're forced to work for free. They don't get any of the money or the benefits from their work. Slaves are rarely taken care of, even though the South said that they took better care of the slaves than they really did. That wasn't true. They were taken care of extremely bad. Slave owners would not allow them to learn. You can't read or write, because if you learn how to read or write, then you become somewhat intelligent. You'd be able to figure out how to analyze things and critically think before you know what you're arguing, why you shouldn't be a slave. And now you're all of a sudden you're set free. So they didn't want them to read or write. Families, this is one of the worst things, is families are separated from each other. Little kids taken away at 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, and no longer allowed to be part of to be with their mothers and fathers. Slave owners used violence to force slaves to comply. This violence included horrible things such as whipping, mutilation, cutting off feet, um, whatever else they came up with. It was just some horrible ways. A lot of it was whipping. Some of it was just abuse, verbal, physical, and sexual abuse as well. And the slave owners used intimidation and mutilation if they ran away and were caught. I don't have time to go over all that stuff. We'll probably look at it in eighth grade when you come back. Okay, but I've got some pictures. Here's this is fairly recently. I don't believe it was. It looks to me like it was in the 1920s in the South. You could see the men in the back with some derby hats or some straw hats. That was very popular in the 1920s. You can see a guy whipping a black man. So even though slavery was discontinued, whipping still continued in some of the southern states all the way up to the 1920s. Slaves would be branded when they were caught in Africa. They were branded with the shipmaster's mark, and then they were sent to North America, South America, the West Indies, the Caribbean islands, things like that. Okay. Oh, and fix that here. It says, why did Southern people have slaves? Well, they made a lot of money off slaves. The slaves harvested cotton. They didn't have to provide slaves with a whole lot of stuff, maybe some clothes. You can see this picture here. I like this picture because it shows slaves in good clothing, and it shows them reading. It shows the kids hanging out together. It looks like they're hanging out with a white kid. And this is a propaganda type picture. That's really not the case. Most of their clothing was tattered and ripped and had holes in it. White kids didn't associate with black kids. Reading was not allowed. So this is a big old propaganda type picture about how slaves are. You can tell the women here, they don't really look too happy about doing this. So it must be some type of a propaganda thing. But the whites down in the South, they made a lot. Not only the whites, there was Native Americans who owned slaves too, and Hispanics. But they made a lot of money off it. And cotton was the big thing. Cotton was 75% of the world's cotton came from the South. This is a huge industry. Factories turned these cotton products into clothes and linen. Owners justified that they were morally right in keeping slaves, that their slaves were better taken care of than the factory workers in the North, which wasn't true. And they argued this war was not about slavery, but it was about the rights of states. Okay, so let's take a look at what the southern states, that's all the red states right here you see, the southern states wanted to do with the West, okay? First of all, there's Los Angeles down here, and Los Angeles was kind of like the goal for the South to get to. They could have some ports. They could. They wanted a country from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast. And in order to do that, they had to go into New Mexico territory. They had to occupy what's called Fort Union, which was a supply depot north of Santa Fe, and kind of north of Las Vegas, New Mexico as well. And then they were going to move into Colorado and take the minefields, the silver and gold minefields of Colorado. They were going to move over to Utah territory and convince, the Mormons over there that they should be part of the South. I mean, they heard that the Mormons, the first president of the Mormon Church didn't agree with slavery, but he said we should just leave it alone. And the second president, which is now 1860s, said that slavery is it's ordained by God, and so they figured they had the side of the Mormons, and then they would move down into California and take California. They'd have all of this land. Okay, so that's the goal, to come into New Mexico, take Fort Union, go to the gold fields in Colorado, take over the Mormons in Utah, and then move over to Los Angeles and have a coastal port where they could trade with the Asian Pacific Islanders and all those, China and Japan and India and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's their goal. All right. Well, this is the worst war in American history. Right now, they've estimated over 700,000 people died from causes of the Civil War. In the population today, if you kind of estimated that to today's population, that'd be about 6 million people who had died. That's a huge amount, and everybody would have been affected. So everybody back then in the 1860s, 30 million people compared to 360 or 330 million today. Um, Everybody would have been affected in one way or another. Now that doesn't include the wounded, people who lost their legs and arms and limbs. So it was a horrible war. It's the worst war in American history. And it starts right here at a place called Fort Union. Before I want to get to that, I want to provide you with a question that you have to answer. All right, so here it is here. This is the first question I need you to write down on the worksheet that I emailed to you. What are the three things that the South had to do to get to Los Angeles and gain Southern California as a part of the Confederacy? There's three things that they have to do. So go back and take a look, and just type in that into the worksheet. Okay, let's go back to the first fight at Fort Sumter. First of all, we're talking about American history here, not New Mexican history, although New Mexico is still a territory. The first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. It's in South Carolina. South Carolina, the first to secede, the first to go away, to split from the United States. And they started to take over bases and forts around Charleston, South Carolina. And there was a fort next to in Charleston Harbor that commanded the harbor under a guy named Major Anderson. And they were saying, we're going to surround you, we're going to attack you if you don't surrender. Well, Abraham Lincoln didn't want to surrender his fort. It's a United States fort, and so he had a choice. Either they stuck it out and they fought to the death, they surrendered and left, or there was a middle ground where you can, the United States could give supplies, not guns or ammo, but just supplies like medicine, food, and clothing to the soldiers there. And they said that's what they're going to do. So the South said, no, that's not, that's an act of war that keeps you in our land, which is South Carolina, even though you've got a fort on it, that's our island. And so they started to bombard the fort. They bombarded the fort, and after about 34 hours or so, the fort ran out of cannonballs to fire. And so Major Anderson had to surrender. Okay, so here's the next question. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Let me go on. So now the war gets started here, and a guy named Major Sibley, who was a major in the United States Army, he was in New Mexico at the time, and he says, well, I'm going to, he was from the South, and he says, I'm not going to be part of the United States. I'm going to, join the Southern Army. I'm leaving. So he took off. He went down to talk to President Jefferson of the Southern states. And he said, look, Jefferson Davis of the Southern states. And he said, look, I've got a plan to get all the way to California. And we have to go through New Mexico, take Fort Union. We have to take the gold fields of Colorado. We have to go into Utah and get the Mormons' acceptance. And then we get into Los Angeles. We have a country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And Jefferson Davis said, yeah, let's do that. So he was commissioned as a general. He was allowed to to build up an army somewhere in Texas, San Antonio, things like that, and get an army to invade New Mexico. So this is the guy that's going to come into our state and try to get New Mexico and turn that into a southern state. Okay. One thing about General Sibley, he was a heavy drinker. He was drunk most of the day. I guess you kind of do that maybe if you have that kind of personality where you have to stay on the forts of the frontier. There's nothing to do. You're bored. So what are you going to do? I guess you start drinking if that's the kind of person you are. And that's what he did. And so he was a heavy duty drinker. And so he wasn't really fit to take New Mexico. Okay. So here's the next question. All right. So this also goes back to the beginning of our lesson. Name 3 reasons why slavery is bad. Okay. Now I'm going to send you in your worksheet. You can take a look. There's a read. There's 2 questions that you got. There's a read, and you got to answer some questions on the read. You send it back to me. I will put it on the grade system, Synergy, whether you pass or not pass, and then we'll move on from there. So this is the second lesson, and I hope you guys are doing well. Take care. I'll talk to you later.